4, 5. Just
okay. I mean, we can do it without the Facebook Live if you want.
no, I think it'll be better starting from there.
Okay.
It should start.
Just give me a sign quickly so we can begin.
Okay, yeah, should be fine now.
Okay. Hello, my name is Mohammed Abbasi. I'm with the Association of British Muslims. Today we'll be talking about solutions to the war on drugs. And the reason I came up with this subject is talking to Neil Woods and also Khalid Masud, who are former drugs officers, undercover and non-undercover officers, drugs operatives, tackling issues around drugs, both in the UK and in other countries, especially in regards to Khalid Masud. Neil is also a board member of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, the LEAP, in the USA and the UK. LEAP is a growing international organization that advocates for evidence-based drug policy and related criminal justice reforms. This group is made up entirely of serving and former police and other law enforcement officers. Khalid Masud is a former Inspector General of Police in Pakistan. Inspector General is a 3-star rank of a Lieutenant General in Pakistan and other countries. He has extensive experience in tackling drugs issues within Pakistan and around the world. He also has a lot of evidence from the United Nations and other areas which he'll be talking about in his conversation. So the way this will work today is we're going to have Neil followed by Khalid speaking, and afterwards everyone will have the opportunity to join in the conversation. This is not a debate, it's a conversation between friends and people who can learn from each other about what drugs are, how drugs affect people, but at the same time how we can tackle the underlying issues concerning drugs in a more mature and better way. So we're going to go to Neil Woods. Neil, can you introduce yourself first of all to some of our friends here? Let me just, if you can unmute, yeah.
Thank you, Mohammed, for that introduction. And thank you for inviting me to this event today.
Thank you.
I think your introduction was fine. I don't think I need to explain too much more about myself, other than for the audience's sake. Basically, I used to catch drug dealers for a living. That was my reason to be within the police service, and I did that with great enthusiasm over many years, both as an undercover operative for 13 years, but also through conventional detective work as well. So it was my area of expertise. Now, I don't know the level of knowledge of this audience. There will be a variety of knowledge listening to me today. So for many of you, what I would ask you to do is to completely suspend your preconceptions and please consider carefully what is actually being said to you today. Now, when I went into undercover work, I felt quite privileged to be able to do so, because as a police officer, I wanted to catch the bad guys. And from my perspective at that time, the worst people in our community were the people who were dealing drugs, because they were behind all of the misery. That's the way that I saw it. That's a very standard way of seeing things. And I was very pleased with myself as a young man, because I found myself, I finally found a niche within the police. I was a terrible uniform cop. I almost got sacked in my first 2 years in the job. I just wasn't very good at it. I wasn't very good at dealing with conflict. But finally, 4 years into the job, and I found my niche, something I could do. And the reason that I was recruited to do it is because there was a great moral panic in the press. Everyone was worried about problematic crack cocaine use and problematic heroin use, and mostly because the tabloid newspapers were telling everybody to be worried about it almost on a weekly basis. So one of the operations I did was actually, after I'd given up undercover work at that point, and I'd given up undercover work because it was taking too much of an emotional strain on me. One of the people from an operation I did, at the end of it, ended up being suicidal because of the way that I'd manipulated him as a vulnerable, problematic heroin user. He thought that I was his one friend in the world, and that my betrayal of him was the last straw for him. Now, that hit me very hard, but I was a ruthless undercover cop, and if you're going to be undercover hunting people in that kind of situation, you have to be ruthless. So I gave it up. But then I got the phone call from the detective sergeant who organised these kind of operations, and he said, "Woodsy, we need you to do this operation because this gang are even worse than the last gangsters you caught." And he was talking about a gang called the Burger Bar Boys, who are a very infamous gang from Birmingham. And they had taken over the heroin and crack cocaine supply in Northampton, about an hour's drive away from Northampton, from Birmingham. And as it was sold to me, they said, "Woodsy, you have to do this job because this gang are using gang rape, sexual violence as part of their reputation building. They're doing the normal kind of gangster things like kidnappings and maimings and murders, those kind of things, but they're also using sexual violence." So I was tempted back into the kind of work. Anyway, I manipulated some vulnerable people into introducing me to this gang. And it was a tough operation. I mean, the first time I was introduced to the inner circle, the 6 of the Burger Bar Boys who were running the supply, I was surrounded by hooded figures while I was interrogated, and these 4 hooded figures were walking slowly around me and sometimes headbutting me on the side of the ear or punching me in the ribs, all of the time being interrogated by this one other figure in front of me. And after several minutes, I thought I wasn't going to get out of the place in one piece. I thought that, knowing the reputation of these people, they were just going to leave me in a broken and bloody mess. And just when I was rather resigned to some more violence, suddenly the guy said, "Okay, what do you want then?" And I said, "I'll have 1 and 1, please." And he sold to me a £20 deal of crack and a £20 deal of heroin. And from that point, I was then connected to the inner circle of that gang. I could buy increasing amounts, and I did over the next few months. I gathered evidence of conspiracy against those 6 Burger Bar Boys, but also 90 other people who were connected to the trade. So by the end of a 7-month operation, there was 96 people I'd gathered evidence against. And I knew that there was no one else to meet. There was no new faces to get to know. There were no new phone numbers I had to find. I caught everybody in that town involved in the trade, from the sex workers who were acting as runners to the people stashing the money, people transporting the drugs, everything. So I thought, this is going to be a huge operation, catching everybody in one go. There was backup from 5 different police forces, an enormous operation, so many people arrested. Anyway, a week afterwards, I spoke to the intelligence officer who was keeping his ear to the ground to understand the impact of the operation. And he said to me, "Yes, we managed to interrupt the drug supply in Northampton for a full 2 hours. 2 hours. 7 months of operation, 96 people arrested, including 6 major gangsters. I almost got myself killed. I was quite convinced on multiple occasions I was going to die for the sake of interrupting the drug supply for 2 hours." Now, I don't know for certain that the Burger Boys' infamous rivals, the Johnson crew, were the people who took up that opportunity to make money. But you can imagine the scene when they heard what the police had done for them. They would have been celebrating. "Wow, boys, put the call in. We're going to make a fortune. Guess what the cops have done for us? They've got rid of the Burger Bar Boys. We're going to make a fortune." And of course, but it took me many, many years. I was very slow on the uptake. I was resistant to the evidence before my eyes that actually all I ever did and all the police ever do when they arrest drug dealers or make big drug seizures, all they do is create an opportunity in the market for somebody else. Because the police are really, really good at catching drug dealers. They're brilliant at it. If you give them twice the resources, they will catch twice as many if you instruct them to do so. But that's part of the problem, because the police never reduce the size of the market, and the market is massive. The illicit drugs market is worth £10 billion a year in the UK alone, £10 billion a year. And the police had never reduced the size of it. In fact, it's constantly increasing. So if the police don't reduce the size of it, what are they doing? Well, what they're doing is they're changing the shape of that market. They're changing the shape of it. And what that changing shape means is that with every passing year, the drug markets become more and more violent. Because in treating this problem as a war, with aggression, with enforcement, what we're doing is creating an arms race. And that's a better description of this war on drugs, actually. It's an arms race, because there's no chance of a peace treaty in this war at the moment. It's just a perpetual arms race where the police get smarter, they have better tactics, they put more resources into it, and the pushback from organised crime in our communities is an increased use of violence, because we've created a situation where it's the survival of the fittest. Those that are prepared to be the most violent and use the most intimidation are the ones who are most successful. Now, there are many aspects of this, the problems of this war on drugs that I could go to in lots of detail. I could talk to you about how the war on drugs marginalizes and victimizes vulnerable people. I could explain to you that drug addiction is not about the drug, it's about the trauma that somebody's going through. The idea that it's a chemical hook from the drug that causes that is simply not true. But there's another aspect that I'm really keen for you all to understand, because this next part is shocking to almost everyone that's not heard this before. On one operation, it was the operation in Nottingham, actually, that ended up where I made the man suicidal. After about 4.5 months into that operation, I've been working very hard to get introduced to a lieutenant of one of the main targets, and the main target was this infamous gangster called Colin Gunn. He was the head of an organisation called the Bestwood Cartel. And after that 4.5 months, I got introduced to this guy, and he interrogated me with a knife pressed into my groin, which I can assure you is not very comfortable at all, especially not when someone's asking you lots of aggressive questions. Now, the day after that event, which had been definitely a long day at work, 2 of my backup team went off sick. We'd been all working very long hours and they went off sick. They were replaced with 2 new police officers who I hadn't met before. I was introduced to the first, I shook his hand, I had no problem with him. The second one, I shook his hand and the hairs went up on the back of my neck. Everything about this guy screamed wrong on an instinctive level. Now, when you've been working undercover for 4.5 months, your perceptions are heightened almost to the point of paranoia. So on an instinctive level, this man was wrong to me. So I went to the rest of the team. I said, look, I'm sorry, I cannot have this guy knowing what I'm doing. So they were excluded for the day. Now that probably saved my life, because 12 months later, when the Bestwood Cartel was brought down by Nottinghamshire Constabulary, it turned out that that police officer was an employee of the gangster, Colin Gunn. He'd been paid to join the police. He wasn't corrupted while he was in the police. He was paid to join the police. And he was paid £2,000 a month on top of his police wages, plus bonuses for good information. Now, I have to make something very clear. I mean, all of the senior police I spoke to afterwards says, yeah, of course this happens. We know this happens. With this much money involved, how can this corruption not happen? So senior police in this country and across the world all know that our current drug policy is causing corruption. But I have to make something very, very clear. That kind of corruption cannot be paid for from any other kind of criminality. It only exists because of our current drug policy, where drugs are illegal. The reason for that is there isn't enough money in any other kind of criminality to cause that corruption, but also it is the mechanism of policing which causes it. So if you go back to what I told you about the Burger Bar boys, and I caught that gang, wherever there is a police success, a raid, a kingpin arrested, whatever it is, the person or people who can take the advantage of that opportunity in the marketplace is generally the biggest gang already. So they expand their influence, which means growing monopolies, growing gangs have more disposable income to corrupt the system. So it is the mechanism of trying to police this that increases the likelihood of corruption. And this is a never-ending cycle until we declare a peace in this never-ending war on drugs. So there are lots of other aspects of this I could talk to and explain, but I've gone a little bit over my time already by a minute. So apologies for that, Mohammed. But I now hand back to Mohammed and to my esteemed colleague. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks for that, Neil. I mean, I've been taking some notes. I'm sure people will be taking notes and ask you questions after this yourself. And Khalid Masud, can you be the next speaker, please? Let me just unmute Khalid Masud, and if you can press unmute, Dr. Khalid. It's all right. We'll just get someone to unmute Khalid Saab.
That must be
Right.
the
Is
phrase.
it okay now?
There you go. There you go.
No.
So Khalid Masud, I hope you found your colleagues' comments interesting. Do you want to speak for about 10 minutes as well?
Yeah, I
on,
will. If you want, I will add something on to it.
no,
Now, you
absolutely.
see, absolutely. I mean,
Do
these
you
are,
want to introduce yourself first? Do you want to introduce
yeah,
yourself?
yes, I am Khalid Masud, and I'm like Neil, I am also a police officer. I joined the Pakistan Police Service and worked at various levels. And then, I mean, over a long period over a long career, at one stage, I found myself in Pakistan's newly established Pakistan Narcotics Control Board. That was, I served a stint in the Pakistan Narcotics Control Board. We were setting up mechanisms, trying to coordinate the work of various police forces, customs department, border control agencies. And then you see, I went back to the police. I had a break in the career. And then you see, again, I found myself at a more senior level, again working for the Ministry of Narcotics Control in Pakistan. In between, attended innumerable conferences. I have uh, attended United Nations sessions. I have been working closely with United Nations organizations at regional level, and I have seen too much. As a matter of fact, I mean, it is over. I am now 70 plus, and you see the range of my experiences is so is so vast that I really don't know how to sum it up. But
Sure.
I will take up the point that Neil
Okay.
makes.
Yes.
You see, the drugs issue became a came on the global agenda. I will not go back into the history, but I will start, from where it really takes off. From 1961, when the United Nations drew up a convention, which is called the Single Convention. That convention, to this date, sort of regulates and coordinates international efforts to stop drugs proliferation and to and enjoins upon, or sort of in a way binds every member state to set up systems to control the use, misuse, trafficking of drugs within their own territories. And the single convention is then from the single convention, there were other conventions that were drawn up. In 1972, there was a protocol. Then there was in 1988, the latest is the United Nations Convention against illicit traffic in narcotic drugs, blah, blah, blah. Now, you see, what Neil is saying, I will like to take up that point. United, every state now is a part of the United Nations. And when a state joins a system, whether it is at the regional level or at the international level, that state surrenders a part of its sovereignty. I mean, the loss of sovereignty became such an emotive issue within in the UK that it ultimately decided to leave the EU. But obviously, no country can afford to leave the United Nations. That is why whatever protocols or whatever system the United Nations wants its member states to adopt, they have to adopt it. How very loudly a country may protest against that system. I mean, the system are certain things that the United Nations wants a particular country to do, may not suit its needs, may not suit its culture, may not suit its traditions. But since the United Nations is there, whatever the United Nations tells a country has to do it. And whether the country is poor or rich, I mean, a country, developing country like Pakistan, a country like Uganda, and a rich country like the United Kingdom, they will do exactly what the United Nations protocols, conventions, directives, they order a country to do. And that is where the problem lies. I mean, we cannot expect Pakistan or the United Kingdom to take any unilateral action that runs contrary to the protocol to which these countries are a signatory. Now, instead of going into the details of each protocol, because these are the things which we had to study very closely. You see, I will tell you the mindset. The first mechanism that the United Nations set up to control the spread of drugs was called the UN UNFDEC, which is United Nations Fund for Drug Abuse Control. Now you see, mark the emphasis on the word control. I mean, it is a criminalized what you call system of supply repression, suppression. Control is the key word. You see, when there was, and now you see this fund was given to various countries where drugs were supposed to uh, sort of grown there, like let us say the Golden Triangle, Pakistan, and Latin American countries. I mean, this fund was used by those countries to take measures to stop the cultivation of these drugs. So this was the United Nations Fund for Drug Abuse Control. But then you see the bosses of the United Nations, which are, I mean, obviously everybody understands what I'm hinting at. I mean, America, let's name that country. America decided that that was not enough. Do more. So UMPDEC was replaced by what they call United Nations UNDCP, United Nations Drug Control Program. So the word was still control, control. Then came the third stage. Now you see, we have, I mean, any pretense or the fig leaf that there existed between drugs being a problem and criminality was abandoned once and for all somewhere in the 1990s when the United Nations merged drugs and crime. Now you see, the drug issues are tackled by what we call United Nations Office on Drug and Crime. Now, the emphasis is always on supply interdiction, and that is what Neil was doing. Now, you see, my experience, and these are the global statistics, and that is the evidence. Even the most well resourced, the most well equipped, and the most technologically advanced law enforcement forces are not capable of interdicting or suppressing 10% of the supply that finds its way into a market. As long as the market exists, and that is the point that Neil was making, you eliminate one gang, the space is vacant, and that space is captured by another gang. So, I mean, the problem is that only 10%, I mean, so much money is spent on police forces, on their equipment. I know, I mean, in countries like the United States and even in Britain, I mean, these narcotics officers in the police department, they get the flashiest cars, they get the most resources, they walk with a swagger. But with all that, what happens? I mean, only 10% of the drugs that come or that proliferate in the society, only 10% of that supply is suppressed. 90% supply is still there in the market. That leads to violence, that leads to misery, and that leads to more corruption, not only overall corruption within a society, and sometimes it seeps through into the law enforcement agency. But UK is still lucky in one respect. I mean, there is some seepage of corruption. This will happen in every country, and in America it is in a way endemic. It happens in every society. Look at Italy. I mean, this corruption has seeped, has gone even into their judicial system. The magistrates, the judges, I mean, they are at the mercy of these Italian drug mafia. So UK is lucky in that respect that it has not still gone to our judiciary, which still, I mean, is immune from this probably ill effect. So we have to look at another way. This the prohibitionist mindset, the supply suppression mindset, criminalizing those people who become a victim of drug use. I mean, this is an archaic policy. This was devised by the United Nations with a particular agenda in mind. I will just say a couple of last words. You see, certain countries were pressurized to the level that they introduced that death sentence for drug offenses. I mean, Thailand, Indonesia, Pakistan, their law says prescribes death sentence for drug offenses. But on the contrary, you see, there is good evidence that some of the wars in Latin America were funded with the blessings of the United States with drug money. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Khalid Saab. I especially am interested actually in pursuing what you mentioned is 10% only illegal drugs are being eliminated. So that means 90% are going through.
They find their way in the market.
They find through. And Neil also mentioned that there's roughly 10 billion is the industry in the
in the
industry.
United Kingdom, it is now 20 billion. That is what the latest report of Professor Dame Carol Blake, her latest report is that came out in 2019.
Okay, I'll just write that down.
That puts the illicit drug market at 20 billion in the UK. But that is I think that is an underestimate.
That's a conservative figure, yes. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to open this up to the audience. If anyone has any questions, if they can raise their hand or so Peter, let me just unmute Peter. So let me, and then Shabdam. So Paul, can you see me? Paul, can you unmute Peter and then Shabnam after that? So we'll take two questions. And we will let the
I'm allowing participants to unmute themselves now.
Okay, wonderful. So so Peter first.
Okay,
Peter?
yes. I have no expertise. I'm just a concerned member of the public who's read your book, and I'm a keyboard warrior. That's my only contribution. So my question is, are there any experts with experience in the area who support the current UK government position on drugs? And what is stopping change?
So did you catch that, Neil and Khalid?
Neil, please, because the UK specific question.
Okay, go for it.
I just missed the last sentence. So are there any experts that support the status quo and what, sorry?
What is stopping change? What is the main thing stopping change?
Oh, I love that question. It's always one of my favourite questions. Essentially, the first part, honestly, there are no experts who can defend the status quo with evidence. It's true, you know, whether whenever journalists organise a debate, they have this idea of pitching me or one of my team against an opposition, somebody else who can defend the status quo with evidence. But there isn't anybody. The only people who are actually publicly defending the status quo are people who are ideologues, people who are obsessive about a moralizing policy, people who believe despite the evidence. So it's really difficult. But you raise a brilliant question, Peter, in that if the evidence is so overwhelming for reform, and the evidence is so overwhelming that the current situation is a catastrophe, why isn't there change? Why are the politicians not changing policy straight away? And the answer basically is because of one part of the answer is as has already been alluded to, is that we have the United Nations conventions which dictate which each government does. But that excuse can't be used anymore because those conventions have already been broken by Uruguay, by Canada, by the United States themselves, who are the architects of this drug war. It's already been broken. So the door is open for the conventions to be changed. Even the United Nations in 2016 invited member states to innovate with reform and regulation. They stated that themselves. So the door is open. But the reason why is democracy. And there is a specific reason why the normal functioning, our normal functioning democracy is not functioning correctly. Because this is essentially a social justice issue. And it's a social justice issue because the drug war affects the most vulnerable and marginalized in our community. It doesn't affect white middle class people. It affects ethnic minorities and vulnerable people massively disproportionately. And so, but the reason that, so it's a social justice issue. Social justice issues don't change through political leadership. They change through social movement. So the social movement has to grow through society in order to have enough political influence for politicians to take notice. Now that is beginning to happen, but it's happening slower than it should do because the police are constantly messaging, both on social media and to the media, that what they're doing is successful and what they're doing is keeping society safe. So almost every day we have images of the police seizing drugs. We have images of a series of mugshots of people who've been arrested. We have images of the police smashing in doors, and the public are being taught and have been taught for decades to believe that this is what successful drugs policing looks like. So the public are lulled into this belief that the current system is reducing drug use, keeping our communities safe, when it's not. And the problem is, this is a massive deception. It's dishonest, because most police, if you ask most police officers, can this war be won? Are you reducing crime? They would probably answer you honestly that no, this war cannot be won, and no, we are not reducing crime. In fact, if you arrest a kingpin, if you arrest a gang, crime doesn't go down, it goes up, because there is generally violence where people compete over that gap in the market. So policing is actually increasing the violence. And this new phenomenon of children being exploited to deal drugs, that's often referred to as county lines, that's my fault. That's actually my fault, because it's a natural strategic response to the kind of tactics I used to use. When I caught the Burger Bar boys, I caught adults. They were all adults, all of them. So the natural buffer zone strategic response is to use children, because if you've got children as a buffer zone between you and the cops, it's much harder for them to catch you. And that's why we've now got children being used. It's a response, it's the arms race. Now, unfortunately, the police are not being honest about this, because the police put out their normal messages. They reassure the public with these images of drug seizures and arrests. And so because the public is not truthfully informed as to the actual outcomes of drugs policing, the social movement amongst that public is growing too slowly. If the police were brutally honest about the actual results of their activities, how quickly would the public change their mind? If there was brutal honesty about the level of corruption being caused by current policy, how quickly would the public change their mind, and how quickly would they be speaking to their members of parliament demanding that they change policy? So it's not just the police's fault, because journalism, the media always presents policing of drugs in a certain way, always as if it's an exciting solution to a problem. So truth is what we need, and that's why we haven't yet got change. But Peter, what I would say is, as part of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership and other allies, esteemed allies amongst the law enforcement community, we are doing our best to speed things up.
Peter, are you satisfied with that answer? Unmute yourself. You have to unmute yourself. We can't hear you. Yeah, carry on. Sorry, can you repeat yourself?
It's a fantastic answer, and I'm completely in agreement with Neil. I'm so frustrated about this because the war on drugs came to my lovely little village in the south of England. We had a murder in a pub, where I did a pub quiz, almost certainly drug related. I started reading about this and I couldn't believe it. The evidence is so overwhelming and nothing's changing. I wrote to my MP, I don't know why. They did.
Thanks for that, Peter. Thanks. Shabnam Mahmood, I think you've got a question, and then after Shabnam, if Ehsan can come in, and then of course Naveed as well, don't worry. So Shabnam, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, please?
Hi, it's Shabnam from the BBC. I look at specifically at British Asian, South Asian communities. Just wanted to find out a couple of things. Just how bad is the problem? Say if you were looking at it statistically, have the figures sort of like gone consistently up in the last few years, or not? Or is it worse within the BAME communities? And if so, what can the BAME communities do to tackle the problem? Can they do more to sort of like help the police in some way?
Okay.
Would you like me to take that as well, Mohammed? Well,
no, absolutely. Go for it.
Thank you for that question. You raised some extremely important points there. First of all, what I must point out is that there is good evidence that there is no community uses drugs any more than any other community. So Black or other ethnic minorities do not use drugs more than white people. It's the same across all communities. But minority groups are affected drastically much more than white people. So, for example, a Black or Asian male is around 9 or 10 times more likely to be stopped, searched for drugs by the police than a white person. They are then more likely to be charged if they are found with drugs, and then they are more likely to be sent to prison, or more likely to be sent to prison for a longer time than a white person. Now, I was never very good at maths, but that's exponential prejudice, exponential. And it's, those numbers are impossible to argue with. So the victims of this policy are clear. Now, you ask about whether the problem is more prevalent. Now, in terms of, it depends where you are, because there are regional and cultural influences as to who it is that dominates drug dealing in any particular area. So, for example, there are areas of West Yorkshire where the heroin supply is dominated by men of a Pakistani origin. Now, that's just to do with the population there and some of the supply routes, that kind of thing. In other areas, it's predominantly dominated by white people. So in those communities, that affects that whole community. That affects the communities of Pakistani origin within that area. It does. But in terms of what the community can do, well, you ask a very traditional format of question there. You asked, what can those communities do to help the police more? Well, this is the point I'm trying to make. The current policy where the police deal with this in punitive terms by investigating it as a criminal matter is adding to the problem. So if, for example, you had the police decided to have a crackdown in Bradford, which they have done in West Yorkshire, say the police decide to invest a lot of money and have a series of 3 months of covert investigations, warrants, arresting more and more people. Let's sweep the town clean kind of rhetoric that announced to the press, you know, we've got this special operation we've done. Look at all these people we've arrested. We've arrested 30 people. We can reassure you, the public of Bradford, that we are doing this to keep your streets safe. And they will even say things like, look, we've seized ounces and ounces of heroin here. This stops it getting onto the streets. Well, you see, that's a lie. It's not true, because what always happens when you have that kind of clampdown is an increase in violence. You have more people intimidated. You have more people being attacked because they're suspected of speaking to the police. People are kidnapped and tortured because they're suspected of talking to the police. So wherever the police increase their aggression within a community, then the pushback is from organised crime with aggression back on that community. So no, the answer is no, that there is no way that the public can use normal policing methods to improve their community. What they can do is they can lobby their police and crime commissioners to invest in health-based approaches. Like, for example, the police and crime commissioner in Cleveland is using police money that would normally be spent on crime investigation, kicking people's doors in, that kind of thing. They're using policing money to prescribe heroin to problematic heroin users in that community. And as a result of that, crime has dramatically gone down. Now, the best way for that community in Bradford to be safer is if they took the same approach, because the most lucrative market, especially for heroin, is the problematic heroin users. If you can look after those problematic heroin users by supplying the drug and looking after them, getting them into treatment and caring for them, suddenly the market has disappeared. Suddenly there isn't the same value on the streets of Bradford to fight over. So a health-based approach will make communities safer, but more policing, passing information to the police, encouraging the police to arrest more people, will do the exact opposite. And there is very good evidence to back that up. So I hope that I've answered your question adequately.
Was that okay, or do you want to ask another question maybe to Khalid Saab? You're muted again. Let me just unmute you.
No, that's fine. That answers the question. I would like some stats about how bad the problem is, and maybe a regional breakdown on that. That might be useful.
Yeah, well, I mean, stats. Well, what I can say is that since drugs were banned, since it's the 50-year anniversary of the Misuse of Drugs Act, and since that act came in, banning drugs, all drugs, and gave the police such powers in 1971, that drugs have become much more accessible, much more varied, stronger, and cheaper. You know, the market has only been going in one direction. Now, I can say that drugs have never been more available. Heroin and crack cocaine and powder cocaine has never been so pure. It's at its purest ever. Both are at the cheapest they've ever been. Now, to break it down into individual statistics, I'd have to show you a graph. I'd have to, it would take up too much time here, but I could certainly direct you to where the evidence is for that if you so wish. But I can tell you with absolute certainty that drugs have never been cheaper or stronger or more accessible. And a very important point, that in any of our communities, children, our young, have easier access to cannabis, Mdma and powder cocaine than they do alcohol or tobacco, because regulation works and prohibition doesn't. So in terms of, you know, I suppose in headline terms, this is a crisis. It is getting worse. And what better indication of that can there be for the fact that in the last few years, it's our children, it's our young people in our communities who are now on the front line of this problem. You know, this has been getting steadily worse. It doesn't take much of a focus on history to see how much this has been getting worse with every passing decade.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks for that. Ehsan, do you have a question for Khalid Saab or Neil, please?
Yes, I do actually. Thanks, Neil and Khalid, for your insights so far. Neil, I found it ironically funny that you were able to stop the drug action for 2 hours, albeit almost getting yourself killed in the process. That was fascinating. My first question to you is, the key takeaway so far from this is that seems to be historically a lot of emphasis on supply suppression. Okay, it's fine, to eliminate, poppy cultivation, to bust, the heroin plants and processing factories. But what about demand reduction, i.e. the social side of getting people off drugs, getting them into rehab and reintegrating them back into society? So, the key battle here is supply suppression versus demand reduction. Do you think that we almost need to kind of press the reset button here and kind of change strategy and just change our tact on how this has been dealt with historically? And my second question is for Khalid. From a Pakistan point of view, Pakistan has as a country, has always been portrayed as a perpetrator of drug abuse. And now the view, especially within Pakistan, is that it's a victim of drug abuse. It's been caught between two horrible wars, first the US and the Soviets in the 80s, then the war on terror, and especially the first war, between the US and the Soviets. It's well documented that that war was funded by drugs. Charlie Wilson's been on record for saying that. So, I think there also needs to be a change of perception about countries like Pakistan, where, the strong belief is that, a country like that is a victim of drug abuse, not a perpetrator. I'd like to have your views on that. So, those are the two questions I had. Thank you.
Well, I was just thinking, Khalid Saab, can you answer
yeah,
that question first?
I will answer both the questions. Supply suppression versus demand reduction. Well, Ehsan, the problem is that in 1961, when the United Nations Protocol, single convention on when the international effort to control the spread of drugs or whatever, it was mounted, it was oriented, directed exclusively towards supply suppression. That is why in my presentation, I use the word every United Nations structure that was erected, that used the word control. So it was always supply suppression. And as Neil also said, there has to be more money into health, into rehabilitation work, into education, into awareness. That was never done. Then there was funding given to these countries which grew drugs. Both in Latin America and in South Asia. Previously, opium used to come from the Golden Triangle, but that Golden Triangle, Southeast Asian opium, at some stage gave way to the opium grown in the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, because that opium is more potent and it is smokable opium. So, but that is a technicality. Now you see, whatever money was given, it was for supply suppression. Catch hold of the gangs, ensure that these drugs, they do not leave your shore, they do not find their way into let us say Europe. It was to protect Europe, but that did not work. So demand reduction, and that is because the entire structure of the entire international structure was built to suppress supply. No what you call worthwhile attention was ever given to demand reduction efforts. Even here also, you see disproportionately, as Neil says, resources are given to the police, to the law enforcement, better cars, more money, more equipment, more gadgetry, and then you see the publicity that comes with it. What publicity will a poor social worker get who is counseling a drug addict? More publicity will be given to somebody like Neil, who busts a gang. He will be the hero. He will be his photo will be displayed on the front page of Daily Mail, and it will be said that he has busted a gang in Bradford, which is bringing heroin from Pakistan. So that is ridiculous. Therefore, the stress has to be changed. There has to be, we have to treat these poor victims of drug abuse. We have to look into it. why this drug abuse or whatever, why do they use drugs? Where, I mean, and what can be done to reduce their dependency on the drugs? Now, the second question is about Pakistan becoming, you see, Pakistan unfortunately got caught in the war between, in the Afghanistan war. And that is where the Pakistan's drug problem started. Now, you see, the problem, SN, is that under this, I mean, religion, there is a very complex relationship between drugs and religion, particularly in Islam. Now, you see, what Ziya did in his enthusiasm, there was use of opium in the Pakistan society. There were these licensed opium retail small shops that were set up during the British Raj. They were called opium vends. The government will supply a certain amount of opium to these vends. People will come, I mean, those who were addicts used to depend upon opium. I mean, they would come and buy opium, and that was it. Overnight, you see, SN, what happened? These vends were closed. So you have a ready-made situation. There is a huge pile of opium that is now become useless. There is a population that uses opium. And then you see the next step was heroin. I will tell you something very interesting. Before, in 1975, as a police officer, I had never heard the word heroin in Pakistan. It was only cannabis and opium, or it was, I mean, these two drugs. But then you see, heroin started to appear because of the Afghanistan war. And then you see, I'm sorry to say that. I mean, the trend for the use of heroin started as in from Islamabad, where we had, I mean, these European, what you call diplomatic stuff, but I'll not go into those details. So Pakistan is now, I mean, it has a huge addict population. As a matter of fact, Neil, if you look at Pakistan, it is a microcosm of the drug phenomena in all its manifestations. It produces drugs, it has trafficking networks, right? And it supplies drugs to the world. So, I mean, it is a, I mean, it is a typical example of the drug phenomena in all its manifestations. So the Pakistan government is probably doing something in the health sector now. And then they are also have launched a very good program, and that is called crop substitution. In the areas as in where poppy is grown, the farmers are being incentivized to grow alternate crops. Let us hope it works.
Thanks for that, Khalid Sab. What I'm going to do, I'm going to go to Navid from Bearded Brothers for a question, followed by Jane Bond, who has a question. So Navid, can you unmute yourself, please? And by the way, Doug McVeigh, you usually have you usually have very good questions. You must ask a question, mate. Afterwards. Wonderful. Wonderful. So, Navid, can you unmute yourself, please, Navid? Wonderful.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Assalamu alaikum and hello to each and everyone that is here. Some amazing stuff has come out of what Brother Khalid and Brother Neil's been saying. That tackling the issue is literally impossible. People like myself who hate drug dealers and clearly are realizing that we're fighting a losing battle, because when one is taken away, there's 30 people replacing him or looking to replace him. But where do we move and how do we move forward? Because corruption, we talk about places like Pakistan being a third world country, and then corruption is going to be rife. But here in the UK, also corrupted police officers and people at top level, because you can't flood a whole country with drugs, and it can't be Abdul and his one-man band that's doing it. So, some people on the top level are absolutely allowing this to happen. And also, why don't they just legalize it, make it less, for the lifestyles of these people, legalize the drugs, get these guys, these victims also need to be seen to. these drug users that have to now sell their bodies, and it hurts me to see these women on the streets having to sell their bodies as cheap as £5 just for a wrap. And even though that we look down at these people, but it's not them, they're victims. So I think that the government here needs to really, really change their act, and or increasing the sentences, because here I know we're in Birmingham, and going to jail is like a family reunion, because you meet your mama, your chacha, your uncle, your auntie. You know, it is just like, okay, yeah, it's a story in the past. I feel that we should take tougher sentences like the Chinese, or sorry, I'll be talking about the Chinese, but you know, life for a life. How many lives of these people spoiling and ruining? And I feel that death sentence would probably be the only thing that could probably make these people change their want them to change their mentality, because you think, if I get caught here at the moment, I can get caught, I can come back, I've got my money stashed away. And I also feel that the families are also responsible, because if you've got a child who's never been to school and is driving a £50,000 car, accountability is very, very important. And also the money taken from these drug dealers should be invested back into the youth. I am doing something, and Sister Shabnam is probably going to be in with me on this project, where we're encouraging youth to start becoming entrepreneurs, and the families are helping them to get off the streets, because they've got an option of either selling milkshakes or selling cars or selling drugs. So, Brother Neil, you know, this is a question for you. Where do you see the future of this issue? Because if people like yourself feel threatened that it's not safe, would you advise people like myself and other people like myself to actually get involved and speak to the police, because we don't really know who we're actually speaking to? What do you think, Neil?
Yeah, thanks for those comments and observations and the question. Just let me pick up on one comment before I answer your question, if you forgive me. You made the point about bigger prison sentences and maybe even the death penalty. I have to make something really clear. There is very, very good evidence from around the world, and a particularly good piece of evidence from the UK Home Office, actually, which was a report released in October 2014, which shows that it doesn't matter the level of punitive action, it doesn't matter the length of prison sentence, even the death penalty has no impact at all on drug use, none at all. So increasing prison sentences, the mechanisms of the criminal justice system, forget it, it doesn't have any impact at all. There's very good evidence. What it does do, if you threaten gangsters with a death penalty, they'll threaten their community to make sure they're not grassed up. So if the criminal justice system steps up the threat, longer prison sentences, death penalty, whatever it is, you get more violence in the communities in response. So violence leads to violence. And another point is, you know, why do people use drugs problematically? Well, people use drugs problematically because they're traumatized and they're hurting. And if you send family members to prison, if you send parents to prison, then you're creating more traumatized children and you're sealing in the problematic drug use for the next generation. So turning up the heat within the criminal justice system always makes things worse. Now, it's important to note that most drug use is non-problematic. 90% of drug use causes no problems to the individual whatsoever. And the 10% that does create a problem, it's a sliding scale. Some people need more intervention than others. But it's important to note that people who have a real problem with drugs, they're dealing with pain. 2/3 of problematic heroin users, 2/3 are self-medicating for childhood trauma. That's either sexual abuse or physical abuse or neglect, or they're dealing with other kinds of mental health problems. Now, these are people who should be cared for and not criminalized. But once we understand that people who do have a problem with drugs have specific underlying problems, then we can stop thinking that it's the drugs causing this, because it's not. It's not the drugs causing this. Now, where do we go from here? I totally agree with you in what you just said, that, you know, why don't we just legalize it? But within the reform world, we don't like the word legalize because it scares people. It sounds like a free-for-all. What we're talking about is taking control. we want to get this problem under control, because at the moment it's out of control, because organised crime decides what drugs get sold to who and where. It's organised crime that decide to sell to young people. It's organised crime that continues selling to people who need to be cared for. So we need to take that control away from organised crime. That's the way to deal with this. And there are different ways we do that with different drugs. So heroin is the easiest one to regulate. It's the easiest drug to take control of. We wouldn't even need any change in legislation in the UK, because doctors can prescribe it if they have a license to do so. When in the UK, we used to prescribe heroin to heroin users up until the end of the 1960s. When we stopped doing that, there was only 1,046 heroin consumers in the UK. 1,046. The moment we stopped doing that, the market was given to organised crime. That's when our problem started with heroin. And 20 years later, and this is a useful statistic for you for the BBC perhaps, 20 years later, that went up to 300,000. Now there's a very clear cause and effect there. The market was given to organised crime. And that's where our problems began. That's where the accelerated violence began. It's where the generational problem came in, where children are growing up in communities affected by that organised crime, and they can only go in one direction. You know, I interviewed 3 generations of gangsters in Liverpool, and I asked each one of these generations, how easy was it for you to get hold of a gun? The gangster from the 1970s and 80s said, no, I could never have got hold of a gun. The people would have said, don't be so stupid. We're not giving you a gun. The second one, who was at one point Britain's most wanted man, he said he was involved in organised crime in the 90s and early 2000s, when organised crime became more international. And he said, well, we knew we had access to automatic weapons if we really needed them, but we'd never give them to young people because that would be stupid. And the third generation, he was 16. He'd escaped from county lines drug dealing. We asked him how easy it is for you to get a gun. And he said, well, I'd need a few hours, he said. And in fact, the last time I needed a gun, I went to the guy and he said, oh, you'll have to come back at the end of the day. I've run out, but you can have a hand grenade if you want. And he said, all right, then I'll have a hand grenade. So we've gone over 50 years from heroin being controlled by doctors with a prescription pad to 15-year-olds with hand grenades. And that is what happened by banning heroin and not regulating it. For all of the other drugs, they're a bit more complicated. I mean, cannabis, you know, we'd look to the way that Canada's done it. We'd look to the way the United States has done it, or Uruguay. For the drugs like Mdma, Mdma is the perfect example of a drug that's not banned because it's dangerous. It's dangerous because it's banned. It's actually a relatively safe chemical. Very, very rare for anyone to develop any addiction problems with it. People tend to just use it occasionally when they want to dance in a field. But unfortunately, because it's not regulated, it's a dangerous product. And sometimes it's too strong or it's got additives in that kill people. So I'm sorry to have probably rambled on a little bit too long there as to what the responses should be. But we're talking about getting things under control. And different drugs have different ways that they need to be controlled.
Yeah, I understand that. It's a no-brainer. Sometimes we just go back to history. But my issue isn't the drug takers, it's the drug sellers. That's what my issue is. So I'm not saying sending drug takers to jail because they've got a mental health issue. And a lot of it may be mental health issue or breakdown in deprivation in housing or whatever. But my issues is the people that are lucratively making money. And I feel that in Small East, I don't know whether you know the dynamics of Small East, every second car is a drug dealer. And I'm not a police officer. But again, if we take them off the road, they're just going to be replaced by other drug dealers. So it makes no difference.
And that's the thing, you see, because the thing is, the key thing is, if they are controlled by drugs, they need to be controlled by the authorities, not by the criminals.
That's correct.
And that's the bottom line. I'm just going to go to.
Thank you very much for that.
Basi, just one. I want to make one point. Yeah.
Go for it.
You see, referring to the death sentence, I will like to add there are quite a few countries which have death sentence for drug offenses. Pakistan is one of them. Indonesia, for example, Thailand has this death sentence. But you see, if you look at these societies also, I've traveled to Thailand, I haven't gone to Indonesia, and I belong to Pakistan. You see, the death sentence was introduced in the year sometimes towards late 1980s. And the problem, instead of going away, I mean, it has multiplied manifold. So death sentence, more punitive measures, I mean, they do not really solve the problem. You have got to have a rethink on the probable causes, and then you have to treat a victim of drug abuse as a member of the society who needs your support.
Absolutely.
A friend of mine who lives in Indonesia, who's quite well in with his community, mentioned to me some of the issues which they're currently facing in Indonesia. And I didn't realize, because I've seen different side of Indonesia, but a lot of drugs pass through Indonesia. And it's, you know, even in spite of these very severe penalties which they have in place. So it's like what you end up doing is you get those individuals who end up getting caught and they get executed. But you know, it's like they're just like individuals within a massive system that is the underworld within those countries. So it's like, you know, how do you close that? And you're not going to close it by just killing a few individuals.
No, absolutely agree. And you see, it's very, very easy. I mean, look at the point of view of I guess, a drug dealer who's earning a lot of money, and you bring in laws that are more stricter. Obviously, there will be more victims in that line between you and the dealer. And I would be more careful, a lot more careful, but I would still continue dealing in those drugs. Jane, do you want to ask a question, followed by Doug and then Sharon? Jane, can you unmute yourself, please? If you can unmute yourself.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted.
Absolutely.
Okay, I want to give everybody a little bit of a background on me. I've been volunteering for a charity working on the project of County Lines. And I also put myself in deep and dirty with the drill artists. And I have a background in the luxury goods industry. And I know where the drug money is spent because it's the industry that I'm in. And one of the questions I've got is, why are the police not using the Proceeds of Crime Act at a lower level? Because I could have had somebody bang to rights based on what they went and purchased in Hatton Garden. The man was clearly on his Instagram bragging about his trappers and his drillers and his nitties. He's got his bricks of money. And he went to Hatton Garden and got a set of teeth grills, which were fitted to his mouth. Now, easy. You could just go to that person. Where did that money come from? Proceeds of crime, done. And I don't see the police are policing it correctly. Also, I don't believe that they're looking at the child exploitation issue properly, because kids as young as 8 years old are being groomed into county lines. And the elders are now 15, and it's ridiculous. So I'd like to know what they're doing about the proceeds of crime, and also, if there is police corruption, what are they doing about the police corruption?
Wow, go for it, Neil.
Yeah, no problem. So
by the way, some of my good friends are police officers. Don't be too hard on them, Neil.
And my husband's a retired policeman.
Oh, no, it's fine. I prefer questions to be as difficult as possible. But
Sure.
but there's a few things to unpick there. First of all, the proceeds of crime. The idea that this problem can be solved by actually going after the finances is something I refer to as the Capone fantasy, because Al Capone is the last gangster who was successfully brought down by finances alone. Because, you know, it's just one tool in the policing toolbox. You know, policing cannot solve this problem. The last 50 to 100 years proves that with, you know, in fairly straightforward terms. And, you know, most proceeds of crime departments, where it's normally overseen by a detective inspector, most departments, they actually cost more to run than they do recover. Now, you could argue, Jane, that they should be trying harder, they should be doing this, but the drugs policing costs more to the police and takes up more resources than anything else, anything. And that includes things like domestic violence or child protection or investigating child sex offenders. Now, put that into context. If a police officer catches a child sex offender or arrests a burglar, crime will go down. So that activity is worthwhile. If you catch a drug dealer or seize his drugs or take his money off him or his new trainers, crime will not go down. So that is not cost-effective policing. So increasingly, police departments are realizing where their resources are best spent, especially after 10 years of austerity. The fact of the matter are, policing drugs does not reduce crime, and more often than not, it increases it. So you mentioned about county lines. Now, of course, you're absolutely right. I mean, county lines is a major political crisis waiting to happen. It's a catastrophe for society. There's estimated 50,000 children, 50,000 involved in this, and that number is growing.
Can I just mention that some of the reporting from Jason Farrell has actually come through me. There was a serious murder of a young boy who was 16 years old in Ipswich, where I grew up. I went to school with his mum and dad. My Facebook went absolutely crazy, and that's when I volunteered to get involved in the county lines. And my opinion of the policing, getting it wrong, goes back to the 80s. And in Ipswich, there used to be a pub when I grew up at the year of the rave scene. So this is when the ecstasy was coming in. I remember them seeding spliffs with cocaine, and I was in and around it. And why I'm so anti the way that the police are doing it, they raided a pub that everybody knew that only drug dealers went, or people went there to buy drugs. They raided the pub, it dispersed the drug problem across the town, and it set the roots for county lines. Now, county lines were working in reverse back in the day. They weren't coming from London into Ipswich. They were going, the boys were going from Ipswich to London to collect the drugs, then sell it. And I know because I grew up and I was around these people. And so I can talk from from experience. Now, I also shared a house with a guy called Lee Norris. His brother was somebody that was doing recreational drugs, and I actually went to an illegal rave with this guy. And I just wanted to experience it. I've never done a line of coke. I don't smoke weed. I don't take drugs. And so I went to this illegal rave, and the guy was taking, in my house, he was taking blotting paper acid into his eyes. He was taking lighter fluid into his mouth. He was popping the ecstasy. He was smoking weed, obviously, and doing anything that he could get his hands on. And it started through recreational drugs. That man, if you could go and Google him now, he's been on heroin. He's been on crack cocaine. His girlfriend was Paula Clennell, who was a victim of the Steve Wright murder of the serial prostitutes in Ipswich. And I also grew up with Annette Nichols' family, who was another victim of that prostitution. So this problem from county lines it was a big mess from the police in the 80s. That's my opinion.
Yeah, well, we've got experiences of
a harrowing tale. I mean, absolutely.
The drug markets, they have been getting more aggressive. There has been more violence consistently since the Misuse of Drugs Act. Absolutely, I understand this, and I spend a lot of time with people who have similar experiences. But and you make a fair point that the police could perhaps have been better in many instances in how they deal with things. In particular, treating these children, they should be treating them as vulnerable people and looking after them rather than treating them as criminals. So there's many things that the police are doing wrong. But the point is, it doesn't really matter what the police do, whether they were behaving perfectly or sussing this out or investigating it in different ways. The point is, this is a result of policy. All of these things that you've just said is a result of current policy. It's because organised crime controlled the markets. That's the root cause of everything that you've just said.
So
And
that's where the proceeds of crime comes in. You know, we all know which family they set the Proceeds of Crime Act up for. You know, and they're notorious in London, and it's just, I don't think that they're using it to the maximum capacity. Now, I used to work in Greville Street in Hatton Garden, okay, and it is frequented. Now, I actually feel, well, before COVID, I was feeling unsafe in that street. It has been taken over by the boys that have made money through county lines. They're all there buying Rolexes. If I was in the police force and policing it right now, every time I arrest somebody or raid their house, I would get their Rolexes and track it back. It's got a serial number, and you can find that that's the proceeds of crime. Take the trappings and the joys out of drug dealing. Most of these boys that are doing county lines at the higher level, it's like pyramid selling, isn't it? And when they've got their Rolexes, they're still living in a council flat or you know, cheap accommodation. They spend their money on luxury goods. So take the luxury goods away from them, and it will reduce the incentive to actually become a drug dealer.
Yeah, I appreciate the sentiment, Jane, and I appreciate the thought that you put into that. But I can really assure you from experience that where you go after money, where you work, because at different levels, you know, the financial investigations successes that have happened in the past, all that happen is that organised crime, at whichever level you're targeting, adapts and just hides their money more. You can't end the problem by chasing the drugs, or you can't end the problem by chasing the money. Honestly, it doesn't have any impact. It just changes the behaviour of organised crime, because the demand for the drugs is the same, and the demand will always be met. The markets, you're not reducing the size of the market by taking the money off people dealing. It just means the next people coming in to deal learn to be much more careful with their money and not buy Rolexes. That's the never-ending arms race. This is a result of policy. The only way we can protect our children is by taking the market away from organised crime. Because the elephant in the room here is the next time you see the Home Office celebrating the police success of rescuing 20 children, arresting 5 men who were controlling them. The elephant in the room is those 20 kids will be replaced by new people being corrupted, by new children being corrupted. Because that 50,000 children that are involved in county lines, that number is going up every year. And those people are getting younger and younger. This is a result of policy. Until we take
okay, so let me explain something else that I've been involved in. I agree with you that they replaced them, and I volunteered for the YMCA, and one of the projects that I developed was, it was called Designed by You, and we were monitoring which children were looking to be groomed for the replacement for the ones that went in prison. And we identified them, we took them away from that situation in summer, because school holidays is prime picking, because that's when they're out of school. And we took them to a music studio. Instead of doing what a council person would normally do, we took them into a music studio where the drill artists in London, the real people that are branded the most violent, and we got them doing creative things and kept them away from the streets to be groomed. We know we successfully saved some children. So I think there needs to be more investment into protecting young children, and also educating for the signs of entrapment. Also, I'm working on a project for PTSD. And this is a direct result of one of the guys that was helping me and mentoring me. And if you know any gang members, he was a former member of North Star. Unfortunately, in November, he was murdered in his own home. And it was desensitized violence. It was a family member, and his 8-year-old son was in that house when it happened. And this man wanted social change. A lot of the elders that are around 30s, they are wanting social change, but they're not going to work with the police to make it happen. They'll work with people like me that are not judgmental of them, but help them deliver and make social change. And the change is only going to come from their own community. It's not going to come from the police or anything that the police does.
No, I think it's wonderful what you're doing, Jane. And in this current policy regime that we have, we need people like you doing your best to look out for these kids. And I appreciate it really very much. But we have to face the fact that you wouldn't be needing to be doing these things if drug policy was different. The problem exists because organised crime controls the supply. And all our children are going to be at risk until that policy changes.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. We're going to go to Doug McVeigh, and then followed by Sharon, and then Rhubarb. Doug, do you want to ask a question? If you can unmute yourself. Sorry to pick on you like that. I don't usually do that, but I saw your name and I thought, you know, you must say something.
People usually ask me to mute, so thank you. I'm from the United States, actually, still here up in Portland, Oregon. I've been involved in drug policy work for, it's going on 4 decades now. I spent a few years in the wilderness. You're one of the few audiences that'll actually understand that reference. In the wilderness, because I'm willing to use the L word. We're more and more of us are now. I should mention, by the way, part of that time in the wilderness I spent working in the illegal market. I have to disagree with something that Neil said. Police are really good at catching people who are using drugs, not so good at catching people who are selling them, or at least in our country, it's the usual suspects who get arrested, which is why we have such terrible clearance rates. And I guess the question is, I'll get to an actual question, and it goes back to what's happening here in my state. In the general election, we overwhelmingly approved a ballot measure that reduces the penalties for simple possession of most drugs, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, Mdma, etc. Now simple possession, personal use amounts will be just a fine, or which could be waived if they agree to go to treatment. That's the part that's gotten the attention, but the part that hasn't is what the legislature is working on, unfortunately, and that's the bigger part, which is funding for the kinds of services beyond just substance use treatment, services like housing and education and mental health care, possibly physical health care. In a lot of cases, people have actual physical issues, which is one of the reasons that they started using opiates in the first place. Like I say, it passed overwhelmingly last November. In the state of Washington, just to my north, their legislature is now considering a bill very much like that. I'm wondering, is there any chance of that kind of move where you, there in the UK, the actually de-emphasizing, it's not, and again, it's by law, rather than telling police this must be your lowest priority because whatever, guidelines, right? We've actually changed the legal status. And as I say, we're trying to put these, is there any chance of something like that happening in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. We have a bit of a complex thing going on with decriminalisation here. So, for example, north of the border in Scotland, the local government is the Scottish National Party, and in October 2019, the SNP brought in decriminalisation, Portuguese style, as part of their policy. It's in their manifesto that if they had the choice, they would have full decriminalisation, so no one would have any criminal conviction for possession of any drug, and that treatment would be the default position should they require it. So that's a great potential policy, but the problem is they're partly doing that because London won't let them do that. So there's all sorts of political problems with that. They've said that they would bring in decriminalisation. Now, south of the border in England and Wales, we have decriminalisation happening in some areas in spite of the government and not because of them. And that's being led by the police. So we have, I think, 43 different constabularies in England and Wales, and many of them have brought in diversion schemes, which essentially are de facto decriminalisation. One, for example, in the Thames Valley, the Oxford area, is it's even pre-arrest. So there's no arrest involved. Someone is found with drugs, they are given an appointment to see a drug worker, a drug counsellor, and that's it. And the drugs are taken off them, though, boo, I suppose. So that is effectively decriminalisation happening in spite of politics. Now, when the first constabulary that did that in the UK, Durham, when they announced that they even press released it, they said, we are decriminalising the possession of drugs in the county of Durham. And they said, to clarify this, no one is going to get sent to court to get a criminal conviction for possession of drugs in the county of Durham. They press released it. They made it quite clear. And that was fantastic. And the response from the Home Office, from the government, was, we expect the police to uphold the law. That's it. That was the only response. So there is a creeping, so the police are leading reform, very much influenced by my organisation, I'm pleased to say. And that's where so the police are ahead of the politics at the moment. And these actions by police is also influencing the social movement amongst the public. So yes, I'm optimistic. But of course, from a policing perspective, I'm glad that less people will be getting criminal convictions for what they choose to do with their own mind and body. But from a policing perspective, it doesn't go anywhere near enough, of course, because even in Portugal, it's still criminals supplying the market. And that's what we need to take the control away from.
Could I ask one more? Just, this is more of an international thing. For General Masud, for the last 4 years, my government has taken a hiatus from drug policy reform and in fact went the other way. Whereas we had under the Obama administration, we had 2 directors of national drug control policy who appeared at harm reduction national conferences and spoke and embraced the idea of harm reduction. For the last 4 years, we've had an administration that has been suing to stop harm reduction projects in the US. We now have we're in the midst of a regime change here in the US. Not quite done, but we've started. We still got to get the Senate, but we now have someone who's the acting director, only the acting director so far, who's supportive of harm reduction. We have a human health services secretary who has actually defended these supervised consumption facilities, who's very much embraced. Has the US absence in drug policy reform internationally been noticed over the last few years? I mean, is this just me, or is that really what's been happening? And is there a chance that we might see some changes now with a better administration?
Now, you see, you have come up with a very interesting sort of, not exactly a question, but information, I would say. The problem, Doug, is that what the United Nations does, United States does at home, it does not encourage other states to do, particularly in the developing world where the drugs would normally come from. Now, you see, probably in cannabis, the United States is self-sufficient. So it does not have to look towards an outside source to get cannabis. But you see, as far as cocaine and heroin is concerned, it is still dependent on supply from other countries. Now, you see, whatever measures it takes, I will give you the example. I mean, for instance, these developing countries which are dependent on the financial, what you call handouts from the United States, they have to exactly do what the United States tells them to do. As I said, Thailand, Pakistan, and a host of other countries in Africa, they have brought in the death sentence because there was the growth and cultivation of poppy was getting out of hand. And they said, all right, hang these people. So Pakistan would still do it. And Neil said something very interesting, that in 2016, there was a United Nations conference, which probably gave some relaxation to the implementation of the United Nations conventions and protocols, whatever. But you see, in 2016, I was in Pakistan and I met with my old colleagues from the Pakistan Narcotics Control Ministry. And there was also what you call a rep from the United Nations based in Pakistan. And he said something very interesting. He said, well, in Pakistan, if you relax these rules on drug possession, growth, cultivation, whatever it is, you do it at your own peril. you will lose the support of the United Nations, because the United Nations will lose the support of the United States. So, I mean, the United States policy should have an impact on other countries. But the problem is that the United States follows two sets of rules, one domestic and one external.
Can I add to that? I just add to that. I totally agree with that. Totally agree. And there's two things going on here to answer the question. In geopolitical terms, it'll have an influence. But even when Obama was in, us people involved in drug policy would actually have our face in our palms at the lack of harm reduction and the attitudes towards it. There has been no good regime in the USA on harm reduction at all. I mean, I despaired at the overdose prevention center not being opened in Philadelphia, for example. It's so frustrating when European harm reduction has become so normal across most of Europe. But so we hope that European harm reduction will spread across the USA now. My organization, LEAP, the USA, is certainly doing its best to make that happen. But in geopolitical terms, we have to remember that our international drug conventions is essentially American moral imperialism, and it's not stopped being so. This is colonialism by any other name. This is the dominance of American thinking by very aggressive foreign policy, and so any shift in America will have an influence on lower and middle income countries more than anything else. That it will have an influence. I speak to cops and people involved in this across Africa. I've spoken to all sorts of politicians in South Africa. It makes a difference what the stance is of the United States, and the geopolitical discussions that goes on at the UN each year in Vienna is frustrating. And I do hope that there will be a big shift because of the new regime in the USA.
Thanks for that, Neil. And Khalid, thanks, Doug. Sharon, do you have a question? Do you want to unmute yourself, please?
Okay, I'm going to take it straight to all continents, because I am going to be working on all continents from the 1st of March. First off, I'm looking at Pakistan because my fellow director is based in Pakistan. Second, I'm looking at the UK. Third, I'm looking at the United States. And fourth, I'm looking at the continent of Africa. So I'm taking it straight to, worldwide. First off, should the word war be removed totally from the name? Because automatically that's inciting violence. That's number one. Number two, everybody has missed one key factor here. Why are we not re-educating the parents as they are giving birth to children, that they don't have to follow in the footsteps of them or their neighbors' kids, etc., etc., etc. That means empowering the children to actually say no. I live in a council estate. Yes, I might be starting a multinational company, but each one of my kids has been empowered to say no. That's because I have educated myself. Number two, why are we not using the Proceeds of Crime Act within the UK to put this education in place, and to put in place the education and programs that need to go into the schools from the ages of 8 to 15 to keep these kids out of drugs? When it comes to other countries, and I hate using the word developing countries because this global pandemic has put us all back into developing mode. Why are we not all sitting at a round table and saying, right, 170 odd countries in the world, let's act as a united front. It's time to act as a united front. Yes, a lot of drugs have to still maintain their criminalized status because they have to be controlled. But what is going to be the new and improved unilateral, right across the world stance on drugs? Because if it's not done internationally, then you are beating your head against a brick wall. The other continent that I'm working with is Africa. I am going straight into the deep end in Africa. In fact, my website has been launched next week. And part of the programs that I'm working with in Africa is human trafficking. And guess what they're trafficking? They're trafficking drugs. Within Pakistan, we're putting in projects that actually encourage farmers to actually come away from those crops. We are re-educating people. It all comes down to education plus information equals empowerment. And that empowerment is the word no. It's the ability to turn your back on generations of culture and to actually say, enough. I choose not to take drugs. I choose not to get involved in violence. So why is every country in the world trying to do their own bit? It's time. This global pandemic has shown us that this is a world without borders. Let's start acting like a world without borders. And let's start actually creating a change that will affect everybody on this planet.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. Khalid Saab, do you want to answer that? Let me just quickly, you keep on muting yourself, so hold on. Let me just, O'Neill, do you want to answer that? Then Khalid can answer it.
I mean, it's great sentiments, Sharon, but there's clear evidence that just say no doesn't work. Any just say no campaign that's ever been imagined and brought doesn't work. It's a great sentiment, and actually trying to run drug policy on those terms is actually what's got us in the mess in the first place. So let me give you an example of a regulated product where we manage the drug much better. Smoking tobacco in the UK is at its lowest since 1940. We do educate people. We do teach our children that we don't want them to smoke. Yes, of course, that has an impact. But the fact that it's regulated has meant that we've got this smoking to its lowest for decades and decades. And we've not done that because it's illegal, because it's not illegal. We've done that because we're in control of it. We have control over how it's packaged, what it looks like, over the branding, over the price, who it's sold to, how it's sold, and at what age it's sold. We have control. It's not controlled by criminals. So it means we have a better way of protecting our young. And of course, part of that package is education. Of course, part of that package is parents and being empowered to discuss it with their children and encourage them not to do it. Of course. But as long as the other drugs, less addictive drugs, are being controlled by organized crime, we do not have the same control, no matter how many times we tell them no. Not everybody has the luxury of the stable family and situation that they can have that communication with their children anyway. So society controlling these drugs is the starting point. And then, of course, conversations between parents, children, and community forms part of that. But without control, without government control, we never reduce that market. We will not reduce the demand for drugs. And one reason for that is that drug use is normal. It's a normal part of human existence. So the best way we could protect people is to control it and to make those drugs as safe as possible, to let adults make informed choices, and to protect our children with access to those drugs.
Thanks for that. Khalid, do you want to add to that answer? You have to press the unmute button on that side. Just there. Don't worry, don't worry. Sana, do you have a, oh, hold on. Sana, do you have a question until?
Yeah, that is okay.
Okay.
I'm now, yeah.
Go for it.
You
Khalid.
see, I mean, Neil has answered all these questions in great detail. And I just want to quickly add one thing. I mean, she very aptly said about this, I mean, women being used for carrying drugs from Pakistan to other parts of the world. I mean, it is something like, it is again the profit motive. You see, if the drugs fetch a price, then you see, as Neil previously said, that, I mean, this is a criminal activity that brings in high dividends to those who control it. And therefore, I mean, anybody can be tempted to sort of carry drugs if they get caught. That is their luck. But you see, this is very unfortunate that people from developing countries, I mean, vulnerable people, are being used for the purposes of trafficking. And one other point that I like to add is that somehow or the other, during the Afghan war, uh, drugs and, I mean, the war on drugs got mixed with the war on terrorism. And I mean, that is something that needs to be taken into consideration, how to couple the two.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, Sana, can you hear us? Sana Baig, are you there? Sharon, do you want to add any let me just, if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I
Sorry.
was trying to get back in. First off, thing is, my kids didn't come from a very stable family. So I can safely say that the estate I'm in, yes, there is drugs widely available, number one. Number two, what I did say was that we don't, yes, it is good to discuss them with our kids, but unless we educate the parents, then we're not going to get very far. Education is what's going to change things. And what I did say was, it's time that all nations of the world sat around the table together and decided to create the change, because one country working on its own is not going to create change. Even with the United States involved, it's not going to create the change. Every country has to be on the same page, because there's no point in having one rule in the UK, one rule in the Republic of Ireland, one rule in the United States. It has to be universal. That's what I actually said.
Well, I mean, I respectfully disagree there, because the only way we're going to get change is if individual nations courageously take steps to change things. So, for example, Canada has courageously regulated the entire cannabis market. They did that on their own, and they are leading the world as a result of that, and they are leading the world by means of example. So European nations are now being influenced to consider cannabis regulation as a result of that particular leadership. So, and you know, if you want to get all the nations around the table to agree, well, Russia's never going to agree to a more reasonable drug policy, and neither is Saudi Arabia, and neither is China. So we actually have, I think the opposite is true. So we need to break away from the United Nations. We need to have a revolution, or multiple revolutions in multiple nations, because by that way we will create an evidence base of drug policy regulatory innovations that will inspire other nations. So I look forward to the day where, I don't know, the Netherlands, for example, regulates the supply, controls and regulates the supply of MDMA. Because once they do that, they will inspire all of the other dancing nations to do the same thing. So we need leadership, and we need revolution from the United Nations conventions.
But Neil, just one thing, very quick point. You see, you mentioned Canada, Netherlands, these are all rich countries. I mean, countries which mostly, I mean, Afghanistan, and let us say even Pakistan, they don't have the luxury of breaking free of these shackles.
Very good point. Yes.
No, absolutely true. I'm just saying, if Sana Baig, are you there now, Sana?
Hello, yes, can you hear me?
Absolutely, Sana. I do apologize. Sorry you were muted for so long and you're trying to get in. Please do.
No problem. I have one question. Either for Neil or Mr. Khalid Masud, if they can tell me, do you feel illegal immigrants are more vulnerable in being groomed into drug gangs? And if so, what is the solution to this?
Yeah, that is a great question, Sana. And the simple answer is yes, absolutely, because immigrants are treated very poorly. And in the UK, there is a very hostile regime to immigrants, particularly from certain countries, where immigrants are not given immediate access to benefits. So which makes them much more vulnerable to looking for easy ways to make money. And they can then be exploited and groomed by gangs. And in fact, there are gangs which would purposefully target immigrants because they're seen as the most vulnerable parts of community. And what organized crime will always do, just like undercover cops like me, we always pick on the vulnerable people first, because vulnerable people are the most easy to manipulate. So yes, in simple terms. Now, what can be done about that? Well, I present myself as an expert in drug policy. I am not, definitely not an expert in immigration policy, and I would risk betraying my non-partisan profile by commenting in too much detail in that regard. But I think it's not unreasonable to say that immigrants, like any human being, should be treated with dignity and respect and cared for, both in basic terms like housing, and also in financial terms. And no immigrant should be left without money to feed themselves. So, does that answer your question?
Sana? Let me just, she's muted again.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, that answers my question. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Jane, do you want to come in with a question quickly before we round it up?
Yeah, I was just curious what the police are doing with regard to businesses that are developed from the proceeds of their crime, you know, what I would call a laundrette industry. Are the police following those industries to try and criminalize them?
Well, yeah, I mean, to a degree, but I would just refer you to my previous answer and some of the points I've made previously, that whether you look at this through the lens of the money within the illicit drugs markets, or whether you look at it through the lens of the actual commodity of drugs which is being traded in these markets, the sheer scale of it is way beyond anything that the police can do. So I referred to at the beginning of this presentation, my esteemed colleague stated that 10% of drugs were seized. That's actually not true. Best evidence states that there's no more than 1% of any of the drug markets are actually recovered. Now, 1%. Now, 1% is less business losses than Marks and Spencer's write-off for theft from shoplifting. So we're talking less business losses than any legitimate business. So when you realize that this is billions upon billions, it's one of the biggest industries in the world, when you realize that in order to actually make any kind of impact either on the drug supply or the interconnected finances which result from this unregulated market, the resources that you would need to even make a dent in this is more than we actually have police on the streets. So you need to look at this in the context. You know, we can look at this and become frustrated and look at it thinking, well, why are they not doing that? Surely if they did that, it would solve the problem. But if suddenly the police directed all of their resources on investigating all of the hairdressers, all of the pubs, all of the cafes, all of the various ways that organized crime spread their risks, and they spread their risks. They spread their risks so that if the police focus on one aspect, they've spread their risks to other ways of hiding their money. If you did that, all that would happen is they would become more careful in that aspect of their risk. And in a fantasy world, in an extreme fantasy world, where you actually could trace electronically or physically or by physical investigation or by teams of detectives, if you could actually trace even 50% of the value of the drug markets and actually seize that, all that would happen is the price of gold would go up, because gangsters would start investing in different commodities and different ways of stashing their money. Because
I think that's past tense. They're doing it in Bitcoin.
Well, yeah. But all right. So say you manage to shut down or seize every Bitcoin, then the commodity would go somewhere else. It's like squeezing a balloon. The balloon just expands somewhere else. It's like trying to sieve water. You'll only ever catch a few drops. It's not worth wasting our energy in even trying to figure out the multiple complex ways this money is found. Our energy is best spent speaking to our politicians to persuade them to change policy, which has caused this situation.
Thanks for that, Neil. I'm just thinking, Samina, just one more question from Samina, and then we'll close this because we've got another Zoom, believe it or not, happening in about 15 minutes. I know, it's crazy times. Samina, do you want to unmute yourself, please?
Hello.
Hello, Samina.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening.
I have been listening this debate and thoroughly enjoyed with the discussion with all the panels. And I must congratulate to Association of British Muslims doing this wonderful job. And I look forward for future programs, these kind of debates. It should be on Zoom, and all over the world people can benefit of it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Samina. Thanks for massaging my ego there, and Paul's and some of our colleagues at the Association of British Muslims. Do you have a question for Neil or Khalid on what you've heard and what your point of view or question might be for them?
I think I must say both the speakers are spoken very well, and I must see in future both the panel members, they come across on the board and discuss few more typical issues which Asian communities are facing living in this country.
Thank you for that, Smina. What I'm going to do, I've got Neil and Khalid's contact details and quite a few of the colleagues here. So maybe if you can text or message your email addresses, we will keep you informed of our next Zoom session. But I think we will continue with these kind of conversations, these kind of open conversations, just because we're Association of British Muslims. It's not just about British Muslim or Muslim issues. It's issues that kind of affect us all. And we need honest, open discussions on this issue and many other issues. Neil, do you want to, or Khalid, do you want to make some closing remarks before we finish off?
Neil?
Well, I mean, thank you all very much for patiently listening to what we've said this evening. All I would say is if you are convinced, or I suspect some of you might have come to this discussion believing that the current system actually does any good. But if you are now convinced of the need for reform, then you are now part of the social movement. And all I would ask is please discuss this with other people. Please support the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. Follow us on social media, share our posts, and just support us in any way you can. And in so doing, we will help this social movement grow. So thank you very much for listening to us.
Thank you, Neil Woods and Khalid Masud. It's been very informative.
I agree with Neil that we have to create a wider social awareness on this very, very important issue.
No, I think no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I've had a message from someone who could only join us for about an hour, and he's asking for a bigger debate, a more international debate, not just British-based debate. What this is Zoom, so I'm sure we can arrange a much bigger debate with our colleague, our friend Doug McVeigh, others in the US, in Pakistan, and Indonesia that Paul mentioned. So Sunny is there in Indonesia, which is only about 8 hours difference. I think it would be about 12 o'clock midnight, but they go to sleep at 2 in the morning, so that will be fine. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for attending. And if there's any other further questions or comments, please email myself or Paul, Saladin Armstrong. Thank you. And Kashan, before we go, Kashan, do you have anything to say? You did message me earlier. Kishan Amar, I'm going to give it over to the bearded brother, our Nav. I think he was pointing his finger up or quickly. Nav,
Okay,
remark?
thank you very much. Thank you once again. And would it be okay for us to share each other's numbers, because there are some valuable people on this panel, which I think collectively it is all about educational and teaching the future generations. And I think it was Sarah, Jane Bond, Sarah Ray. If it's okay for your details to be shared with myself by Brother Mohammed. If so, I think I'd like to sit down and have an in-depth conversation with you guys, if that's possible.
Wonderful. Nav, some of our colleagues, our friends, are actually putting their email addresses into the chat box. So if you could quickly copy that, or do you want me to do it?
I think you should do it.
All right, thank you. I shouldn't have said that.
I think
Neil,
my colleague
thanks.
Mohammed Abbasi can connect anybody who wants to be connected
Thank you. That's
after this
very
session.
sweet of you.
And I'd just like to thank you, Mohammed, for putting this together. I think you've done an excellent job, and this has been a really valuable Zoom webinar. So thank you very much for that. And thank you to Neil and Khalid for taking part, and everybody else who joined in with the discussion.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you to yourself and also the University of Birmingham for allowing us, for helping us to put this together. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.
Walaikum salam. Good evening.
Good evening.